think Donald Trump, who even portrayed himself as Jesus Christ a few days ago, he doesn't get dragged into anything. Like Donald Trump doesn't get dragged. Now, did Israel want the war? 100%. I mean, they have been talking about going after Iran, the head of the octopus, former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett. His philosophy was, he called it the head of the octopus strategy. Like, if you go for the head, the arms will not be able to survive, speaking of the proxies. So Israel 100% wanted to go to war. But I cannot imagine that the American administration, headed by President Donald Trump, was forced. Nobody forces Donald Trump. I don't think that America was dragged.
Welcome back to Two Lawyers, Three Opinions. I'm Monique Beadle, a lawyer on staff with the Jerusalem Institute of Justice. Today, we're bringing you an exclusive behind closed doors conversation that we recently held with veteran Jerusalem-based journalist Nicole Jansezian. The global media is entirely fixated on political rhetoric, what the politicians are saying. But behind the scenes, there's a massive strategic and practical shift that's occurring in the Middle East, as all of the major players reorganize their position on the board. So we bypass here the sound bites, and we're going to discuss the real stakes in Lebanon, the wildcard of the Saudi regime, and the United States' new playbook in the Middle East region. So here's our briefing with Nicole Jansezian. My first question for you is, the U.S. is currently brokering talks between Lebanon and Israel. So can you cut through the noise for us, help our audience understand who are the major players, what are the actual stakes, and what would a win look like for Israel here?
It's the first time that Israel and Lebanon have had direct talks in over 40 years. They're basically two countries in a state of war. They don't have diplomatic relations. And so the fact that the Israeli ambassador, the Lebanese ambassador to the US, met with Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State of the US, brokering the talks. So I don't think there was much that came out of that initially, but just the fact that it happened, I think, is extremely dramatic. And I dare say that if everything stays status quo with the war with Iran, that this could possibly be, in my opinion, this could probably be the biggest outcome of the war, that there is some sort of possibility of normalization between Israel and Lebanon. Now, Hezbollah is the Iranian proxy group that's based in Lebanon, and like they're entrenched in southern Lebanon. And as the Iranian proxy group, but they are kind of a standalone militia on their own. They had upwards of 150,000 to 200,000 weapons, like missiles, rockets, drones, even before the war started, like October 7, 2023. And also, I think they have something like 100,000 fighters in their army. So it's a very formidable group. They, of course, are there, to as the front line against Israel, but also they have gotten involved in the politics of Lebanese society, and they're in the government, they're in society, they are also like humanitarian in some ways. So they're very influential. But what you see now, that with these talks that are going on, is that the Lebanese people are finally, in some ways, saying, okay, we've had enough. I think they voted in parliament in the fall of last year that to disarm Hezbollah and all other militias in Lebanon. And they haven't yet been able to do it, or they haven't done it. The Lebanese army hasn't done it. And I think in some ways they're looking right now at the mutual benefit. Like, for Israel, of course, does not want Hezbollah there. And I think now you see more people in Lebanon coming to that conclusion that we need to do something. We need to get rid of them. And there are more and more voices speaking out against them. Now, all of that aside, it doesn't mean that the Lebanese are suddenly going to love Israel. They're is a lot of anti-Israel sentiment in Lebanon. And so it's not necessarily going to smooth that over right away. But if the governments can come to some understanding and bypass Hezbollah and then figure out a way to disarm that group, whether it's through the Lebanese army or with the help of the Israeli army, which the Israeli army is currently actually doing in a way because they're in Lebanon, they're fighting and they have troops on the ground there. So if that can happen, then I think that would be so far in looking at all of the results of the war in the whole region. I think that could be one of the biggest results, the most positive of the entire war.
Yeah, I think what was really interesting this morning was Ambassador Yechiel Leiter. He's Israel's ambassador
Mhm.
to the United States who participated in those talks that you mentioned. He did a press gaggle and was asked the question, what about the French? Because the French had tried to position themselves as mediators. And he made a
Mhm.
very blunt comment. He said, we're basically trying to keep the French as far away from these talks as possible. And we don't consider their involvement to be constructive in any way. My personal take on that is that I've seen that the French want to reinforce the United Nations peacekeeping group, UNIFIL, which has been stationed on the border for decades now, has allowed Hezbollah to build tunnels underneath its own bases, has not actually succeeded in disarming any single Hezbollah operative. What's your take on the French and the role that they're playing in Lebanon?
Basically, what I see is America moving in to Lebanon, and that's something that's been going on for a couple of years. Now, I understand that the French have history there, but in the recent politics, I really see a lot of plays with Lebanon, like from the US, from Trump's previous term, and also, again, like the people that he's appointed, they're really putting Lebanon front and center in the Middle Eastern agenda. So I I don't necessarily have a view on what the French involvement could be or should be or even is. It's just that I see America saying, okay, enough is enough. Like, let's solve these issues. And you see, they're doing it in Syria for better or for worse. I mean, that's a whole other hornet's nest there. But you see that they're doing that in Syria. And I think they've been doing it in Lebanon for several years. And only now are we really seeing the fruit of that. Listen, France never got Israel and Lebanon to the table, to a mutual table. The fact that the US did that, and for any foreign policy that you might, with good reason, not like about, what American foreign policy, this is a milestone in foreign policy. So I just see it as an American play that has sidelined the French. And by the way, the UNIFIL officers are, a few of them have gotten killed. I think maybe the casualty count is 5 in this particular round. And sometimes it's just crossfire or it's by Hezbollah. So they're probably going to want to get out of there as well. I mean, you would think down in southern Lebanon. So it's going to be very interesting how
Mhm.
it plays out.
So, since you started talking about the more ambitious and constructive US role, let's talk about this persistent media narrative that Israel has dragged America into a broader regional conflict. So, as a Jerusalem based reporter, how do you respond to that narrative?
I would say, as an American or as an observer of politics, I don't think Donald Trump, who even portrayed himself as Jesus Christ a few days ago, doesn't get dragged into anything. Like Donald Trump doesn't get dragged. Now, did Israel want the war? 100%. I mean, they have been talking about going after Iran, the head of the octopus. I think that was former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett. His philosophy was, he called it the head of the octopus strategy. Like, if you go for the head, the arms will not be able to survive, speaking of the proxies. So it has been in the Israeli playbook for years to go to war with Iran somehow or another. And obviously, look at the intelligence that they had on the ground to be able to do what they did. I mean, you could argue with the results and whether you call it victory or not victory, but just the fact of what they did accomplish means that it's the result of years of studying the ground there and having sources and having intelligence and having strategy. Now, so Israel 100% wanted to go to war. But I cannot imagine that the American administration, headed by President Donald Trump, was forced. Nobody forces Donald Trump. America is a country that probably matches Israel in military and intelligence. And so I can't imagine that they were hoodwinked by Prime Minister Netanyahu's desire to go towards Iran. Now, if- so I don't think that America was dragged.
The Jerusalem Institute of Justice, or JIJ, is the only organization in Israel providing completely free legal aid to wounded IDF soldiers. Since October 7, over 22,000 soldiers have come home with injuries, physical and psychological. And the reality is that getting disability recognition can take years of medical committees and paperwork. Most of these soldiers and their families can't afford a lawyer on top of everything else they're dealing with. JIJ's attorneys handle the entire process start to finish completely free for the soldiers, but only if people like you donate. They've already helped over 400 wounded soldiers and won $10 million in disability benefits, all of which goes directly to the soldiers and their families. You can support their work and help a wounded soldier at jij.org/help. If you care about the people who put themselves on the line to defend Israel, donate today.
So let's talk about the Gulf as a region as a whole and help us understand Saudi Arabia and the Emiratis' interest in this war. The Emiratis have taken a lot of hits from ballistic missiles and drones.
Yeah.
The Saudis have as well. And then if you have time, I want to get into whether there's credibility to these rumors that the Saudis actually want this conflict to run this course to weaken Iran.
Of all of the Iranian ballistic missiles that Iran launched from its soil, Israel only got 17% of them, and that the 83% were spread over Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, Kuwait, Iraq, Oman, Qatar, even Qatar. So there are a few theories. That one was that hit them hard and hurt their pocketbooks so that they pressure the Americans to stop the war. And then the other one was just to weaken their neighbors. And one result of that was that it's probably clarifying for these countries who really is an ally and who isn't. Now, with Middle Eastern politics or Gulf politics, there's always a handshake. It's one hand and a sword behind their back on the other. It's a region that has trust issues, but it's also a region that has very sharp economic interests. What I see is possibly a clarification of, okay, well, Israel, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Not that they're all enemies with Israel. The UAE and Bahrain aren't. And then there's Qatar and there's Saudi Arabia's like friend, but not officially. And then the Kuwait, Oman. But with them coming under attack and with the same interests as Israel economically, the Strait of Hormuz being open for them, that's a crucial issue, that it could drive these countries toward better relations or establishing relations with Israel. But what Saudi Arabia already started doing was shipping by land. Like, okay, you're going to block us in the Gulf, no problem. And they were shipping down to the Red Sea. But what could happen then in the future is if there are relations with Israel that open up, that they could ship to land all the way across to the Mediterranean Sea. And then from there, be even closer to Europe and then avoid going down south of Africa and coming back up. I'm not saying that this was the end game, but when I looked at the map, I was like, oh, this is something that I'm sure others have already thought of and might be thinking, okay, let's lay some pipe. There were pipelines being laid several years ago, but now could be the time to even go up to the Mediterranean Sea.
The Port of Ashdod is a pretty natural destination spot for that pipeline. The Saudis give off a lot of rhetoric about how they won't normalize with Israel until Israel recognizes a Palestinian state or Israel takes, irreversible steps toward Palestinian statehood. They kind of change a little bit in their rhetoric. Do you think that there's a likelihood that they drop that rhetoric because their economic interests are in the driver's seat?
I think it might be nuanced in a different way. in the future. Like it may not be contingent on statehood now and then we'll sign. It could be, like you said, steps. Let's take steps. I think they're still going to stand with the Palestinians in some way, but I think the way they do is going to change.
Yeah. Now, can you talk about the Emiratis and their interests and how they're
Mhm.
positioning themselves in this war?
They have very legitimate fears because they are that close to Iran. Their economy is dependent on that Gulf and on that strait. So they are walking a fine line. I think you can see that in their statements and their lack of taking military action and just sort of hoping that they would get away with few casualties, which they did. And they got away with few casualties.
So there's chatter in the media about interceptor stocks. The Emiratis, rely heavily on the very expensive US Patriot missiles.
Mhm.
And to use a Patriot missile against a drone, it's a maybe $1 million Patriot missile against a $50,000 drone. The economics don't work. And so Vladimir Zelensky has come in with his solution.
Yes.
He said, well, we've been battling these drones that the Russians have been sending
Yeah.
over our skies, and we have a little helicopter drone which fights that drone. So it's been interesting to see how he's walked into the Middle East and positioned himself as a helpful and useful ally. To me, that seemed interesting to see that some of the Gulf states, which have traditionally been aligned with Russia, are now seeing it within their interests to play a little bit of a different
Yes.
game and to be a little bit more invested in Ukraine's security. So, that's another wild card that's happening as a result of this war. Another wild card is we see Iranian nationals living all over these Gulf countries. They run businesses. They live in Dubai. They live in Abu Dhabi. They set up shop in Qatar. Some of them are regime affiliated. Some of them are not regime affiliated.
At some point I looked up and I'm like, wait a second, he's like on his third country or something right now. Now, Russia is still, let's say also because Russia is with Iran, that's probably also part of what Zelensky took seized the moment to be like, let me insert myself with now, with against Russia's ally in the region. There's also interesting ties between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. And Pakistan hosted the
Can you explain why would Pakistan host these talks between the
yeah,
US
yeah.
and Iran?
Usually, like when we've had in the last couple of years negotiations, like when Israel's been involved in negotiations, the brokers have been Qatar, Egypt, sometimes Turkey, and suddenly it's Pakistan. First of all, they have good relations with both the US and Iran. They have a 900-kilometer border with Iran, and I think that's about 500 miles. So they are also, I think they have a 20% Shiite population. And I think one of the concerns was that if Iranian Shiites, if the regime gets overthrown and people flee the border, they didn't want to disturb the population with any sectarianism. They have an economic crisis, and they need to stay on the US's good side. But at the same time, they have good ties with Iran. They have actually $10 billion trade agreements with Iran in all different industries. And they are the first Muslim nation to acquire a nuclear weapon. It's almost like Iran sort of looking up to Pakistan, like, how did you do it? Like, give us some advice. Like, we also want to. And I think how Pakistan did it was also like behind the scenes, suddenly it's like, oh, we got a nuclear weapon. And it was under the nose of every other country that said, no, you can't have one. So anyway, it looks like they have a lot to share, like technology wise and also strategy with Iran about the nuclear weapon.
See a critical distinction between Pakistan and Iran on the nuclear question. They're both Muslim countries, of course, but Pakistan's military regime seems slightly less psychotic than Iran's. The IRGC is a Mukawama sect of 12er Shias who believe that they're going to usher in and bring back the Mahdi by destroying Israel and America, Israel being the little Satan, America being the big Satan. So the idea is that we can't entrust such a psychotic regime with such a powerful weapon when the raison d'etre of your own foreign policy for the last 47 years has been the destruction of Israel. Pakistan does seem like a little bit more, slightly more of a rational player. It does privilege its own economic interests. There has not been a very recent massacre of Pakistani citizens at the hands of their own regime, like there has been in Iran. I want to bring this to my final question before we go to the audience for Q&A. We've seen that in prior U.S. administrations, almost every single administration for the last 47 years has been negotiating with the Iranian regime. And generally speaking, it's the Iranians who have the leverage. So we might see that the U.S. has some leverage here. But if the music stopped today, and if the current lines were just frozen in place, who do you think comes out with the upper hand?
America still has 50,000 troops in the region. They have warships going there. They have aircraft. They haven't withdrawn. There's no bombing right now, but they haven't withdrawn. Everybody's wondering, is Trump bluffing again? Because let's be real, the Iranian points and the US points are night and day. Look, Iran was very badly damaged. Obviously, their leadership took some big hits, but the regime is made to regrow itself. So it's comprised of a million participants at different levels. On the other side, I've interviewed analysts that say that it's like if you keep replacing parts on your car with a replacement part, that eventually it's going to fail. It's going to break because the replacement parts are never as good as the original. I do know who got the worst end of the deal, and I think it's the Iranian people who were hoping to see regime change.
It's worth just recapping what the United States has put out as their non-negotiables. They've said you will not have nukes. You will give us your fissile material. You will reopen the strait. You will not become a toll taker in the strait. You'll stop the ballistic missile program. So, of course, the Iranian regime wants completely the opposite. It wants the U.S. to promise to never again attack Iran. It wants no more nuclear inspections. And I think it wants to continue to immunize its nuclear program behind its wall of ballistic missiles, and certainly wants to strengthen that. And if it can get the naval blockade broken and the strait opened up, it can once again resume that supply chain from China of all the material pieces that they need in order to rebuild their ballistic missile program. Now, of course, the U.S. and Israel have done intense damage to the infrastructure for that program, but all of that stuff is metal. It can all be rebuilt. And I think the Iranian regime has shown that it's pretty dedicated to rebuilding it. And now let's move on to the questions from the audience. So next question is from Avi. Do you think about hegemony from Turkey has been stopped with the war?
Turkey has occupied now a part of Iraq that they were not before. And Turkey is probably not satisfied. They are probably going to get involved in some way. They're in Syria, they're in Iraq. And also now speaking of Africa, because if you know, a couple months ago, Israel became the first nation in the world to recognize Somaliland as an independent country. It is right across it's on the Bab el-Mandab Strait, which is across from Yemen, a strategic place for Israel. So now then Turkey is involved in Somalia and some other countries over there. I don't think as with Erdogan, Turkey will ever be done trying to exert itself.
Shimon, he asks, IDF Chief of Staff Zamir recently warned cabinet ministers that the military manpower shortage could cause the IDF to collapse in on itself. Do you think the manpower shortage will eventually force the government into mass Haredi drafting? Where do you see the manpower crisis heading?
Of course, that's the issue that keeps coming back, that, there is a mandatory army service here for, 18-year-olds, boys and girls, have to join the army. But there are exemptions, and the exemptions now span more than 30% of the country because the Arabs are largely exempt, and they are if some way or another they get exempt, and that's 20 to 22% of the population. And then the ultra Orthodox Jews are also 12 to 13% of the population, and they do not believe in serving in the army. It is the political issue of the ages. However, no easy way to solve it, because Netanyahu in government where his party serves, and by the way, his coalition is comprised of the national religious, which are big, nationalists, and they serve in the military. But the other part of his coalition are the ultra-Orthodox parties. And so to stay in power, they all have to come to an agreement. And it looks like they are not going to force a draft of the ultra Orthodox. So at this point, I don't see it happening. Now, everybody's going to get a little lax right now because we have a ceasefire, but the reservists have been like going back like several times. So it's definitely a national issue that Israel has to deal with. And I don't know how they're going to.
Dennis asked several questions. I'll pick one of them. He says that why is it so difficult to completely eradicate Hezbollah in Lebanon? Your thoughts?
They're entrenched geographically in one area specifically, but they're also all over the country. They started out in Lebanon, I think it was in the 1980s or maybe a little bit before that, but as a movement, as a charitable organization, as, there to help and to finance, so, whether it's like, welfare issues, hospitals, schools, healthcare, things like that. And Hamas did the same thing in Gaza. So they came in, and won the hearts of the people. And also they are Shiite, and so the Shiites were also drawn to them. And it doesn't mean only Shiites like them, or but then they also became politically active, and they are very powerful. The I've heard it said that Hezbollah as a militia is actually more powerful than Lebanon's army. So that is why they are extremely hard to eradicate.
Yeah. I was sitting with a Lebanese Christian who moved to Saudi Arabia, who was reflecting on, he said, well, Hezbollah wasn't a threat 40 years ago. I said, why do you say 40 years? That's an interesting number. Why not 47? Why not 30? Why not 20? He said, well, before the Iranian regime existed, before the Iranian Revolution, the Shia of southern Lebanon were farmers. And yes, there were a lot of them, and they lived in a certain area, and they lived next to Christians, but they didn't have weapons. With the rise of the Islamic Revolution and the Islamic Republic, suddenly they had weapons, and they became this formidable fighting force, larger, as you said, than the Lebanese army. So another question, this is from Riyadh. What are the reported humanitarian impacts inside Iran, inside Israel, inside Lebanon, and the neighboring countries?
Great question. And I don't have much clarity on what's happening in Iran. The media there is state controlled, and the internet there has been out for 48 days. So you can only get one narrative. And so I don't know. I mean, obviously, Iran was hit badly. Infrastructure was damaged. I don't know the death toll reports. Now, in Lebanon, it's another story. I think we have a little more clarity. The death toll is over 2,000, but I don't know the breakdown between operatives, terrorists, Hezbollah, and or civilians, but civilians have been killed. There's now, I think, over 1 million people from southern Lebanon are uprooted from their homes, because the Israeli military says, hey, evacuate this village, we are going to bomb it. And so there are, so one side, oh, great, you saved their lives. On the other side, they've got no home now. And so there's a crisis going on in Lebanon in terms of displacement. In Israel, I would say it's been more dealt with. The damage from the war it's concentrated. It's not as pervasive, and that we had like fewer casualties here and like better defense systems. So I would say that there isn't necessarily a humanitarian crisis in Israel going on at the moment.
Nevertheless, we've lost 24, I believe, civilians in this round of war. And that includes several families killed together. 22 of the 24 casualties were people who were not inside their bomb shelters. And that's not just because people are crazy and lazy, but the vast majority of these cases were elderly and disabled people who couldn't make it to their shelters on time. I think it's important for people to remember, if you live in Naharia, if you live up in the northern areas, you maybe only have 15 seconds to get from the time of your red alert to get to shelter. And there's not a proliferation of bomb shelters despite perceptions. If you're extremely elderly and you're getting 5, 6, 7 alerts in the middle of the night, it's very, very difficult to go down multiple flights of stairs with your caregiver and get there in time.
I actually wrote an article about an organization that was petitioning the Supreme Court to get more accessible bomb shelters. Oh, and that would be Jerusalem Institute of Justice.
We continue that fight. We had a breakthrough. The Jerusalem municipality did set up and overnight accommodations for disabled people who want to go underground. So that's a fight we continue.
Amazing.
Yeah, well, that's all our time for questions. Nicole, I just want to thank you for cutting through the noise with us, giving us these critical on the ground insights.